Michael Anderson's world fractured into 1,000 pieces as he read the letter his father left behind. The man he'd spent 35 years calling Dad wasn't his father at all, and the truth about his real parents was buried in a war that had ended before he was born. The mahogany desk still smelled like his father's pipe tobacco. Michael Anderson's fingers traced the worn edges of the antique writing surface, his mind swimming with memories of watching James Anderson grade papers in this very spot. The autumn sun filtered through the study's bay window, casting long shadows across the room's book-lined walls. 3 days had passed since the funeral, but the house retained an eerie stillness, as if holding its breath. "You don't have to do this today," Lisa said from the doorway, her voice gentle. She held 2 steaming cups of coffee, the aroma mingling with the lingering sense of leather and old books that defined his father's sanctuary. Michael accepted the cup, grateful for its warmth. "Mom's heading back to Florida tomorrow. We need to start sorting through everything before then." He glanced at the towering stacks of papers, military memorabilia, and teaching materials accumulated over his father's 40-year career. 7-year-old Emma peeked around her mother's leg, clutching her grandfather's old Navy cap. "Can I help, Daddy?" "Of course, sweetheart." Michael lifted her onto his lap, adjusting the oversized cap that slipped over her eyes. "Want to be my special assistant?" The child nodded solemnly, her small fingers running over the gold oak leaf pin still attached to the cap's brim. "I miss Grandpa." Me too, me too." Michael shared a look with Lisa over their daughter's head. His wife's eyes reflected the same concern they'd held since James's unexpected heart attack last week. She worried he was pushing himself too hard, trying to be strong for everyone else while barely processing his own grief. The grandfather clock in the hallway, another family heirloom, chimed 10 times. Michael could almost hear his father's voice. "Time waits for no man, son. Better get moving." James Anderson had lived his life by the clock, a habit ingrained during his naval career and carried into his years as a history professor. Setting Emma down, Michael began methodically sorting through the desk drawers. The top right held decades of carefully organized correspondence. James had never fully embraced email, preferring the permanence of handwritten letters. The left drawer contained teaching materials, syllabi yellowed with age, but meticulously maintained. "Look what I found." Emma held up an old photograph album, its leather cover cracked with age. Lisa settled on the floor beside her daughter as they began flipping through pages of family history. Michael had listened to Emma's delighted exclamations at baby pictures and Lisa's gentle explanations of various relatives, focusing instead on the task at hand. The bottom drawer stuck slightly, requiring a firm tug. Inside, Michael found a single cream-colored envelope, his name written across the front in his father's distinctive handwriting. His heart stuttered. The paper was recent, not yellowed like the other documents, and the seal was still intact. "Michael?" Lisa noticed his sudden stillness. "What is it?" He held up the envelope, throat tight. "It's addressed to me." Dad's handwriting. The room grew quiet, save for the steady tick of the grandfather clock. Even Emma seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, pressing closer to her mother. Michael's hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal. Inside, he found several pages of his father's precise script, along with what appeared to be old military documents. The letter began simply, "My dear son, if you're reading this, then I've passed on, and it's finally time for you to know the truth." The first paragraph stopped him cold. He read it again, certain he must have misunderstood. Then a third time, his coffee growing cold beside him, the autumn sun climbing higher in the sky outside. The words remained unchanged, but his world shifted on its axis with each reading. "Michael?" Lisa's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What does it say?" He cleared his throat, but his voice emerged as a whisper. "I'm not his son. Not biologically." The papers trembled in his grasp. He wasn't my real father. Emma looked confused. "What do you mean, Daddy?" But Michael could barely hear her. His eyes raced over the rest of the letter, absorbing fragments that sent his mind reeling. "Your biological father was David Miller, my best friend in the Navy. Saved my life in Vietnam. His last request, promised to raise you as my own." The room began to spin. 35 years of memories kaleidoscoped through his mind. Baseball games in the backyard, graduation ceremonies, his wedding day, Emma's birth. Every moment now viewed through a new lens of understanding or misunderstanding. Lisa took the letter from his shaking hands before he could drop it. Her eyes widened as she scanned the contents, one hand covering her mouth. "Oh, Michael." He stood abruptly, needing space, air, distance from the revelation that threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew about himself. The familiar study suddenly felt foreign, as if he were seeing it through a stranger's eyes. His gaze caught on the wall of family photos. Generations of Andersons staring back at him. Features he'd always proudly claimed as inherited now seemed to mock him. "Does this mean Grandpa wasn't my real grandpa?" Emma's innocent question cut through his spiral. Michael looked at his daughter, his flesh and blood, no question there, and saw his own confusion reflected in her eyes. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? The grandfather clock chimed again, marking another hour in a life that suddenly felt like a carefully constructed fiction. Through the window, leaves scattered across the front lawn, carried by an autumn wind that seemed to whisper of change, of secrets, of truths long buried but finally unearthed. Michael found himself in the kitchen an hour later, methodically pulling out every photo album his mother had stored in the bottom cabinets. Sarah Anderson had always been the family historian, documenting every milestone, every holiday, every ordinary Sunday dinner with her trusty camera. Now, studying each photograph with new intensity, he searched for signs he should have seen before. "I made some fresh coffee," Lisa said, placing a mug beside him. Emma had finally been convinced to take her afternoon nap, leaving the adults to process the revelation in relative quiet. "Your mother called. She's on her way back from the grocery store." Michael nodded absently, focused on a Christmas photo from when he was about 12. In it, he sat between his parents. No, between James and Sarah, unwrapping a model ship kit. The joy on James's face seemed genuine enough. Had it all been an act? "I keep thinking about genetics class in college," Michael said, his voice hollow. "Remember how we had to trace inherited traits? I did my whole presentation on how I got Dad's chin, his eyes, even the way his hair started graying at the temples early. He ran a hand through his own hair, already showing silver at 35. Was that all just coincidence?" Lisa settled beside him, her shoulder pressing against his in silent support. "The letter mentioned your biological father, David Miller. Are you going to try to find out more about him?" Before Michael could respond, the front door opened, and Sarah Anderson's voice called out, "Michael? Lisa? Could you help with these bags?" Michael froze, his mother's familiar voice now carrying unfamiliar weight. Lisa squeezed his hand before rising to help, leaving him alone with his tumultuous thoughts. Sarah entered the kitchen moments later, her arms full of groceries. She stopped short at the sight of the photo albums spread across the table. Her face paled. "You found the letter." It wasn't a question. Michael looked at his mother, the woman who had raised him, loved him, kept this secret for 35 years, and found himself studying her features too. Her blue eyes so different from his brown ones. Her delicate build, nothing like his tall frame. "How could you not tell me?" The words came out sharper than he intended. Sarah sank into a chair, her hands twisting in her lap. "We wanted to so many times, but James, your father, he worried it would change everything. He loved you so much, Michael. From the moment he first held you in that hospital." "Tell me about David Miller," Michael demanded, pulling out the military documents from the letter. They say he was Dad's best friend in the Navy, that they served together in Vietnam. What happened to him? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. David was extraordinary. He and James met in officer candidate school, became inseparable. David was brilliant, passionate about history just like James. He fell in love with a nurse named Rachel while they were stationed in San Diego. They married just before deploying to Vietnam. She paused, reaching for one of the oldest albums, turning to a page Michael had never paid much attention to before. There, in a faded color photograph, stood 3 young people in uniform, a younger version of James, his arm around a man who could have been Michael's twin, and a pretty woman with auburn hair. Rachel was pregnant with you when they got their orders. Sarah continued softly. David was so excited about becoming a father. He used to write her letters every day, making plans for the future. She touched the photograph gently. Then came the ambush. David, he pushed James out of the way of an explosion. Saved his life, but lost his own. Michael stared at the man in the photograph, his biological father, trying to reconcile this stranger's face with his own reflection. And Rachel? She died in childbirth, Sarah whispered. There were complications. James was there. He'd promised David he'd look after his family if anything happened. He called me from the hospital, devastated about Rachel, terrified about this tiny baby suddenly in his care. We'd been dating for about a year by then. He told me he'd understand if I wanted to walk away, but she smiled through her tears. How could I? We got married 2 months later, and you became ours. Lisa, who had been quietly putting away groceries, joined them at the table. Did anyone else know? Just James's parents. God rest their souls. They loved you just as much, Michael. Being a grandparent has nothing to do with DNA. Sarah reached across the table, hesitating before touching Michael's hand. Please believe that everything we did out of love. Michael pulled his hand away, standing abruptly. The walls of family photos seemed to press in on him. Generations of Andersons watching this unraveling of identity. I need some air. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, ignoring Lisa's concerned call. The autumn afternoon had turned crisp, leaves crunching under his feet as he walked without direction. His mind raced with questions. Did he have other biological relatives out there? Had David Miller's family ever wondered about him? What else had been kept from him? The familiar streets of his childhood neighborhood felt different now, as if the revelation had altered not just his past but the physical world around him. He found himself at the local park where James had taught him to throw a baseball, where they'd spent countless weekends discussing history and literature, where James had helped him prepare for his own teaching career. Every memory now carried a double edge. The love he'd always known, shadowed by the weight of deception. Yet even as anger and confusion churned inside him, another emotion began to surface, a profound gratitude for the man who had chosen to be his father when he didn't have to be. The sun was setting when Michael finally turned toward home, his thoughts settling into a new pattern of understanding. He had more questions than answers, but one thing was becoming clear. The truth about his biology didn't negate the lifetime of love and care James Anderson had given him. If anything, it made that love more remarkable. Still, as he walked, Michael couldn't shake the image of David Miller's face in that old photograph. Somewhere out there was another family tree, another history, another part of himself waiting to be discovered. The next morning dawned gray and cold, matching Michael's unsettled state of mind. He sat in his father's study again, but this time the letter lay open before him alongside his laptop. The military documents had provided enough details to begin a search. Lieutenant David Miller, United States Navy, killed in action in Vietnam, 1989. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, both eager and hesitant to dig deeper. I checked the flight schedules, Sarah said from the doorway. She was supposed to return to Florida today, to the retirement community where she'd moved after James's retirement. I can change my ticket if you need me to stay. Michael shook his head, not looking up. "You should go." I need some time to process this." Sarah lingered, clutching her coffee cup like a shield. "There's something else you should know. In the attic, there's a box marked DM. Your father, James. He kept everything he could find about David. Letters, photographs, newspaper clippings. He wanted you to have them when the time came." The revelation hit Michael like a physical blow. Even in death, James was still revealing layers of the truth, carefully preserved and waiting to be discovered. Why didn't he tell me while he was alive? Why wait until now? "He was afraid," Sarah admitted softly. "Afraid you'd feel differently about him, about us. Afraid you'd want to find David's family," and she trailed off. But Michael heard the unspoken fear. "Afraid you'd choose them over us." The grandfather clock struck 9, and Sarah reluctantly went upstairs to finish packing. Michael stared at the military documents until the words blurred. Finally, he stood and headed for the attic stairs, his footsteps heavy on the creaking wood. The box wasn't hard to find, sitting prominently among decades of stored memories. Michael's hands trembled as he lifted the lid, dust motes dancing in the weak light filtering through the attic window. The first item he pulled out was a bundle of letters, held together with a faded rubber band. The top envelope bore a postmark from Vietnam, addressed to Rachel Miller, 1247 Ocean View Drive, San Diego. Michael began reading, and time seemed to stop. David Miller's voice emerged from the yellowed pages, full of life and hope and dreams for his unborn child. "My dearest Rachel, another endless day in this green hell, but thoughts of you and our little one keep me going. James showed me the baby clothes you sent. I can't believe how tiny they are. We spent hours talking about what our child might become. James swears it's a boy and already has plans to teach him sailing. I told him he's welcome to try, but with your genes and mine, this kid is more likely to have his nose stuck in a book." The letter blurred as tears filled Michael's eyes. He blinked them away, continuing to read. Page after page revealed the man who had helped create him. Brilliant, funny, deeply in love with his wife and unborn child. There were philosophical discussions about raising a child in uncertain times, detailed plans for future family adventures, and constant references to James's role as Uncle Jamie. A sharp rap on the attic door made Michael jump. Lisa stood there, concern etched on her face. "Your mother's car service is here." Michael descended to find Emma, hugging her grandmother goodbye while Sarah tried to maintain her composure. When she turned to him, the carefully constructed walls he built since yesterday crumbled slightly. "Mom," he said, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I'm not angry. Not really. I need to understand." Sarah clutched him fiercely. "Read the letters," she whispered. "Read them all. Then you'll understand both your fathers." After she left, Michael returned to the study with the box. Lisa brought him coffee and sandwiches throughout the day, but otherwise left him alone with his discoveries. The box contained dozens of letters, photographs, and newspaper clippings. He found David's college thesis on Civil War naval tactics, academic awards, and even a half-finished manuscript about naval strategy in Vietnam. But it was a particular photograph that stopped his heart. David Miller stood in his dress whites, one arm around Rachel, both beaming at the camera. The image could have been taken yesterday. The man in the photo was so clearly Michael's reflection that it felt impossible no one had ever questioned their resemblance. A folded paper fell from behind the photograph. Michael recognized James's handwriting immediately. "My son, I've carried these memories for you, protecting them until you were ready." David Miller was the finest man I ever knew. He died saving my life, but his last words weren't about himself. They were about you. "Take care of them, Jamie," he said. "Take care of my family." I made a promise that day, not just to David, but to you. When Rachel died, and I held you for the first time, I knew you were meant to be my son. Not because of duty or obligation, but because of love. You have always been my greatest gift, a reminder that even in war's darkest moments, life and love persist. You are your father's son in so many ways. His intelligence, his passion for history, his quiet strength. But you are also my son, through every choice and moment we've shared. I hope you can forgive us for waiting to tell you. Know that you were never less than fully and completely loved. Dad Michael sat back, the letter trembling in his hands. Outside, rain began to fall, drumming against the study windows. The sound transported him back to countless rainy afternoons spent in this room with James, discussing books, grading papers, sharing the comfortable silence of kindred spirits. The door creaked open, and Emma padded in, clutching her grandfather's navy cap. "Daddy, are you crying?" He pulled her onto his lap, breathing in the sweet smell of her hair. Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're learning important things about love, sweetheart. About Grandpa? About both my fathers, Michael said softly, the words feeling strange but right on his tongue. And about how sometimes the best families are the ones we choose. 3 days after discovering the truth, Michael found himself in the history department's faculty lounge at the university where he taught, staring unseeing at his cold coffee. The familiar buzz of academic life continued around him. Colleagues discussing lectures, students hurrying through hallways, but he felt oddly disconnected from it all. Every class he taught about the Vietnam War now carried new weight, knowing his biological father had died there. "Earth to Michael," said Callan Chun, his department head, waving a hand in front of his face. "You've been staring at that coffee for 10 minutes, still processing your father's passing." "You could say that," Michael replied, wondering how to explain that he was actually processing the existence of two fathers. He'd taken bereavement leave after James's death, but now the ordinary world demanded his attention again. "Just going through some family history." Caroline settled into the chair across from him, her sharp eyes studying his face. "You know, I met your father at last year's faculty dinner. The way he talked about you, so proud of carrying on the family tradition of teaching. Said it was in your blood." Michael flinched slightly at the word blood, but Caroline didn't notice, continuing. "He donated quite a collection of Vietnam-era documents to our library archives. Have you had a chance to look through them?" Michael straightened in his chair. "What documents?" "Military records, personal accounts, photographs, quite a comprehensive collection." He said it was important to preserve the real stories of the men who served. She tilted her head, considering. "Actually, there might be something there that would interest you. Want to take a look?" Minutes later, they stood in the climate-controlled archive room as Caroline pulled out several boxes labeled Anderson Vietnam Collection. Michael's hands shook slightly as he opened the first one. "I'll leave you to it," Caroline said, sensing his need for privacy. "Just remember to log anything you take out." Along with the boxes, Michael began carefully sorting through their contents. Most items were exactly what they appeared to be: military documents, maps, and photographs collected by James during and after his service. But tucked into the bottom of the second box, he found something unexpected: a leather-bound journal with D.M. embossed on the cover. His phone buzzed, a text from Lisa. Emma's school called. "She's in the nurse's office, upset about something. Can you pick her up?" "I'm stuck in court all afternoon." Michael carefully placed the journal in his briefcase, logged it out, and headed to his daughter's elementary school. He found Emma sitting in the nurse's office, her eyes red from crying. "What happened, sweetheart?" Emma launched herself into his arms. "Tommy Sanders said I was lying about Grandpa being a hero in the war. He said his dad told him Professor Anderson was just a teacher. But you said Grandpa was a hero." Michael's heart clenched. Which grandfather was she talking about? The one who raised him or the one who died saving him? Both were heroes in their own ways. "Let's go get ice cream," he said, making a quick decision. I think it's time we had a special talk. At the small ice cream parlor where James had often taken Michael after school, Emma attacked her chocolate sundae while Michael gathered his thoughts. How do you explain adoption and wartime sacrifice to a 7-year-old? Remember how we talked about families being special because of love? He began carefully. Well, I learned something amazing about our family recently. I had 2 fathers who loved me very much. Emma's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. 2 daddies? Yes, one was Grandpa James, who raised me and loved me and taught me everything I know. The other was a brave Navy officer named David, who was Grandpa James's best friend. He died saving Grandpa's life in the war, before I was even born. Emma considered this, her face scrunched in concentration. So you had a daddy who made you and a daddy who raised you? Exactly. Michael marveled at his daughter's simple wisdom, and they were both heroes. David Miller, my first father, gave his life to save his best friend. And James Anderson, the grandfather you knew, spent his whole life making sure I knew I was loved. Can I see pictures of your other daddy? Yes, sweetheart, and maybe we can learn about him together. Michael touched his briefcase, thinking of the journal waiting to be read. Would you like that? Emma nodded enthusiastically, then grew serious. Daddy, if you had 2 daddies who loved you, does that mean you love me twice as much? Michael pulled her close, ice cream forgotten. I love you with my whole heart, Emma, just like both my fathers love me. Later that evening, after Emma was asleep, Michael sat in his study, so similar to James's, and opened David Miller's journal. Lisa brought him tea and settled nearby with case files, offering silent support as he began to read March 15th, 1989. Another night watch with Jamie. We talked about the future, his plans to teach history, my dreams of writing books. He's met someone special back home, a librarian named Sarah. The way he talks about her, I think she might be the one. Rachel's latest letter came today with a sonogram picture. Our child's first portrait. Jamie jokes that with 2 historian parents, this kid is destined for academia. Michael read until his eyes burned, absorbing David's thoughts, hopes, and fears. The final entry was dated just 3 days before his death. The words seemed to reach across time, from one father to his unborn son. I don't know why, but I feel I should write this. If anything happens to me, I want my child to know you were loved from the moment we knew you existed. And if I'm not there to tell you myself, know that you have a second father in Jamie Anderson. He's the best man I've ever known, and he'll love you as his own. I'm sure of it. Rain pattered against the windows as Michael sat in the county records office the following morning, surrounded by stacks of old newspapers and directories. He had taken another personal day, driven by an urgent need to piece together the rest of his story. The journal had opened a flood of questions about his biological mother, Rachel Miller, and her family. The clerk, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, had been surprisingly helpful when Michael explained his situation. Military families often leave traces, she'd said, pulling out boxes of records from 1989. Especially in a Navy town like this. After 3 hours of searching, he found what he was looking for: Rachel Miller's obituary. The yellowed newspaper clipping included a photograph that made his breath catch. She had Emma's smile. Rachel Elizabeth Miller, née Taylor, 27, passed away on September 12, 1989, during childbirth at Naval Medical Center, San Diego. She is survived by her son, Michael David Miller, and her sister, Catherine Taylor of Boston, Massachusetts. She was preceded in death by her husband, Al T. David Miller, killed in action in Vietnam, and her parents, Robert and Elizabeth Taylor. Michael's hands trembled as he read the words. A sister. He had an aunt somewhere in Boston. His phone vibrated. A text from Lisa. How's it going? Found anything? He quickly typed back, I have an aunt. Catherine Taylor, Boston. Lisa's response came immediately. Want me to run a search? Law firm databases might help. Before he could reply, Mrs. Patterson appeared with another box. Found something interesting, she said, pulling out a thick folder. Your mother was a nurse at Mercy Hospital. They did a memorial piece about her in their newsletter. The hospital newsletter featured a full-page tribute to Rachel Miller, describing her dedication to pediatric nursing and her work with military families. Colleagues remembered her infectious laugh, her skill with difficult cases, and her excitement about becoming a mother. She used to sing to her patients, one quote read, said every child deserves to feel safe and loved, even in a hospital. When she found out she was pregnant, she would pat her belly and say, "This one's going to know all the best lullabies." Michael closed his eyes, imagining the mother he never knew singing to him before he was born. A memory surfaced. James singing Blackbird by the Beatles as he rocked Michael to sleep after nightmares. Had Rachel sung that song too? His phone buzzed again. Lisa had found something. Catherine Taylor, professor of nursing at Boston University. Several published papers on pediatric care. Want her contact information? Michael stared at the message, his heart racing. After 35 years, his mother's sister was just a phone call away. But what would he say? How do you introduce yourself to an aunt who might not even know you exist? The decision was made for him when his phone rang. Lisa calling. I did something impulsive, she said without preamble. I called her office at BU, said I was doing research on military nurses in the 80s, and mentioned Rachel Miller. Catherine's secretary said she's actually giving a guest lecture here at the medical school tomorrow. Michael, she's in town. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Here? Now? The lecture's at 2 p.m. I have the details if you want them. Lisa paused. You don't have to go if you're not ready. But Michael was already gathering his things. Thanking Mrs. Patterson. Send me the information. I need to see her. That evening, he sat with Emma on her bed, looking through the old photographs he'd found. This is my mother, Rachel. She was a nurse who helped sick children feel better. Emma touched the photograph gently. She looks like me. She does, Michael agreed, his throat tight. And tomorrow, I might meet her sister, your great Aunt Catherine. Are you scared, Daddy? Michael pulled his daughter close. A little. Sometimes grown-ups get scared too, especially when they're about to meet family they've never known before. Like when I met Cousin Joey for the first time at the picnic, Emma asked. I was scared, but then he shared his cookies and we became friends. Michael chuckled. Something like that. The thing is, Emma, families can be complicated. Sometimes they're hidden from us, like my other father was. Sometimes they're far away, like your great Aunt Catherine. But that doesn't make them any less real or important. After Emma was asleep, Michael found Lisa in their bedroom, reviewing case files. She set them aside as he sat heavily on the bed. Talk to me, she said softly. I keep thinking about James, Michael admitted, how he must have felt knowing this day might come. He kept everything, every scrap of information about my biological parents, but he still feared losing me to their memory. Lisa took his hand. He didn't lose you. If anything, learning about David and Rachel has shown how extraordinary James's love for you was. He chose to be your father, chose to honor their memory while giving you a family. Tomorrow could change everything, Michael said. Catherine Taylor might not want to know me, or she might have information that changes how I see everything again. Whatever happens, Lisa assured him, you have a family that loves you. Emma and I are here. Sarah loves you. And you have two fathers who loved you enough to make sure you would always be cared for. Michael nodded, reaching for David's journal on the nightstand. He'd been rereading it each night, finding new details, new connections. Tonight, one passage seemed particularly relevant. Jamie and I talked about family today. He said, blood matters less than choice. that the families we build through love are just as real as the ones we're born into. I hope my child understands that someday. Love multiplies. It doesn't divide. The medical school auditorium buzzed with pre-lecture activity as Michael slipped into a seat near the back. He'd arrived 20 minutes early, his heart thundering in his chest every time the door opened. Lisa had offered to come with him, but this felt like something he needed to face alone. The projector screen displayed the lecture title, Generational Trauma in Military Families, a Nursing Perspective by Catherine Taylor, Ph.D., RN. Below, it was a biography that Michael had already memorized from his morning research. Decorated nursing career, multiple publications, advocate for military families. At precisely 2 p.m., the department head approached the podium to introduce the speaker. And then she was there, a woman in her early 60s with Rachel's auburn hair now streaked with silver. Their shared eyes and a commanding presence that immediately hushed the room. "Thank you for that kind introduction," Catherine began. "Today's topic is deeply personal to me. My sister was a military nurse who worked extensively with families affected by the Vietnam War. Her own story, losing her husband in combat while pregnant with their first child, shaped my understanding of how trauma ripples through generations." Michael gripped the armrests of his seat. She was talking about his parents, about him, though she didn't know he was there. His existence was a footnote in her story, a tragedy that had shaped her career. Rachel believed that healing happened not just through medicine, but through understanding and connection. Catherine continued, her voice catching slightly on her sister's name. She used to say that every patient carried not just their own wounds, but the echoes of their family's pain. The lecture continued, weaving clinical research with personal observations. Michael barely breathed, absorbing every detail of his aunt's mannerisms, noting pieces of Rachel in her gestures and speech patterns. When she spoke about the impact of loss on military families, her eyes seemed to look directly at him, though he knew it was impossible for her to recognize him. During the Q&A session, Michael's hand rose almost of its own accord. Catherine nodded in his direction, and suddenly he was speaking, his voice steadier than he felt. "You mentioned your sister's work with military families," he said. "Did she leave any writings or records about her experiences?" Something flickered across Catherine's face. Recognition, perhaps, of something familiar in his features. "Rachel kept detailed journals of her work," she answered carefully. "I've used them in my research, though some parts remain too personal to share." After the lecture, Michael waited as Catherine spoke with faculty members and students. His phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "How are you holding up? Emma says to tell you she's sending brave thoughts." Finally, the crowd thinned. Catherine was gathering her materials when Michael approached the podium. Up close, the resemblance to his mother was even more striking. "Dr. Taylor," he began, then faltered. "How do you tell someone you're the nephew they never knew?" She looked up, and this time the recognition was immediate. Her papers slipped from her hands, scattering across the floor. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You look just like David." They stared at each other for a long moment, the scattered papers forgotten. Catherine's hand trembled as she reached out, not quite touching his face. "Michael?" He nodded, unable to speak. "I thought they told us you didn't survive." Her voice broke. "The hospital said there were complications, that both Rachel and the baby. I tried to find out more, but by then you had disappeared. James Anderson, he was listed as next of kin because of David's will. He told the hospital he would handle everything. He adopted me," Michael said softly. "He and Sarah raised me. I only found out the truth last week, after he died." Catherine sank into a nearby chair, her professional composure cracking. 35 years, she breathed. "I've carried Rachel and David's memory for 35 years. Never knowing their son was alive. I have Emma now, my daughter," Michael said. "She has Rachel's smile. I didn't know that until I saw the photographs, but she does. Tears spilled down Catherine's cheeks. A great niece? Rachel would have loved that. She always wanted a daughter. She wiped her eyes, straightening. Michael, I have so many questions, so much to tell you. Would you have time for coffee? The campus coffee shop was quiet in the late afternoon. They sat in a corner booth, decades of unspoken history between them. Catherine pulled out her phone, showing him photographs he'd never seen. Rachel as a child, the Taylor sisters growing up, Rachel and David's wedding from a different angle than the ones in James's collection. She loved him so much, Catherine said, looking at a photo of David and Rachel laughing at some forgotten joke. When we got word about David's death, she refused to believe it at first, said their baby would need its father. She made me promise to tell the baby all about David if anything happened to her. James kept everything, Michael told her. Every photograph, letter, document. He made sure I would know them when I was ready. Catherine's hands clenched around her coffee cup. I was so angry when we couldn't find you. I thought maybe James had taken you away out of grief or guilt. I never imagined he was raising you, loving you, keeping Rachel and David's memory alive. He gave me their love in his own way, Michael said. I understand now why he waited to tell me. He wanted me to know I was chosen, not just inherited. The following Saturday, Catherine Taylor sat in Michael's living room, surrounded by the contents of James Anderson's carefully preserved boxes. Emma perched on the arm of her chair, fascinated by this new great-aunt who carried so many stories of their family's past. Your mother made this, Catherine said, pulling out a yellow baby blanket. She knitted it during her night shifts at the hospital. Said it helped her stay awake and feel connected to you at the same time. Michael touched the soft wool, imagining Rachel's hands creating each stitch. I think this was in my baby pictures. James and Sarah must have kept it. I kept everything, Catherine marveled, sorting through the documents. Letters I never knew existed, photographs I thought were lost. She paused, lifting a familiar leather journal. Is this David's? Found it in Dad's, in James's academic collection at the university, Michael explained. He donated a lot of Vietnam materials to the archives. Catherine opened the journal with trembling hands. I remember him writing in this. He took it everywhere, jotting down observations, plans, dreams for the future. Her voice caught. May I read it? Of course, Michael said. It belongs to our family. Lisa appeared with fresh coffee and her laptop. I think I found something, she said, turning the screen to show them a newspaper clipping from 1989. It's about a memorial service at the naval base. There's a photograph. The black and white image showed a younger, James Anderson standing at attention beside a pregnant Rachel Miller, both of them facing a memorial wall. The caption read, LT. David Miller's widow and best friend attend dedication ceremony. I remember that day, Catherine said softly. Rachel insisted on going, even though she was 8 months pregnant. Said David would have wanted to be remembered as part of something bigger than himself. Emma, who had been quietly absorbing everything, suddenly spoke up. Aunt Catherine, did my grandmother Rachel sing lullabies like Daddy said? Catherine smiled, though her eyes glistened. She knew hundreds of them. Your mother loved music, Michael. She played guitar and had the most beautiful voice. There should be. She dug through another box, triumphant as she pulled out a worn cassette tape. Here, she recorded some songs for you before. The room fell silent as they stared at the tape. Michael's hand shook as he took it. I don't suppose anyone has a cassette player? Actually, Lisa said, disappearing into the garage. James gave us his old one last Christmas. Said we might need it someday. Minutes later, Rachel Miller's voice filled the room for the first time in 35 years. The sound quality was poor, but her warmth came through clearly as she sang Blackbird, the same song James had later sung to Michael. Hello, little one. Rachel's voice said between songs, "I'm recording these so you'll always have a piece of me with you. Your daddy David loves the Beatles, so we'll start with those. And here's one my sister Catherine taught me." Emma crawled into Michael's lap as they listened, and Catherine reached for his hand. 3 generations connected by a voice from the past, by love that had found its way home through decades of silence. Later, after Emma was in bed, Catherine shared more difficult memories. "When we couldn't find you," she said, "I started working with military families, hoping somehow I'd cross paths with you. I kept expecting to see David's eyes or Rachel's smile in every child I treated. Why didn't you try to contact James directly?" Michael asked. Catherine's face tightened. "I did, once about 5 years after, but he'd moved, changed jobs. The military records showed him as your legal guardian, but I couldn't find him. Eventually, I convinced myself that maybe you really hadn't survived, that it was better to cherish Rachel's memory than chase ghosts. And now? Now, I understand what he did. He protected you, loved you, made sure you would know your heritage when the time was right." She straightened, wiping her eyes. "Michael, there's something else you should know. Rachel left letters, one for each of your birthdays until you turned 18. I've kept them all these years, hoping." "She wrote to me?" Catherine nodded. She knew the pregnancy was high risk. After losing David, she wanted to make sure you would have pieces of her, no matter what happened. "James never knew about them. Would you like to read them?" Michael stared at his coffee, emotions warring inside him. I think I need time. This is all still so new." "Of course," Catherine said quickly. "They've waited 35 years. They can wait until you're ready." She hesitated. "But Michael..." "One thing Rachel wrote in her last letter to you. She said that if anything happened to her, she hoped you would be raised by people who would love you as fiercely as she and David did." It seems she got her wish. The grandfather clock struck 10, its familiar chime now carrying echoes of all the fathers and mothers who had shaped Michael's life. Outside, a warm spring rain began to fall, and Michael thought of James Anderson, somewhere beyond this world, finally free of his secret burden. "He gave me everything," Michael said quietly. "A home, an education, a family legacy. But most importantly, he gave me the truth when he knew I was ready to understand it." The box of Rachel's birthday letters arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier from Boston. Michael left it unopened on his desk at work, teaching his classes with the weight of those unread words pressing on his mind. His lecture on the Vietnam War that afternoon felt different, more personal, more urgent, as he discussed the human cost of conflict. "Professor Anderson?" A student lingered after class. "You seemed different today when you talked about the soldiers' families. More emotional." Michael gathered his papers slowly. Sometimes history isn't just dates and facts. Sometimes it's about understanding the ripples that flow from one moment to the next, how they shape families for generations. In his office, the box waited. 18 letters, one for each birthday he'd never shared with his mother. His phone buzzed, Catherine checking in. The letters arrived. "Take your time. They're not going anywhere." He brought the box home unopened, setting it beside David's journal on his desk. Emma found him there after dinner, staring at both containers of his past. "Are those Grandma Rachel's letters?" she asked, climbing onto his lap. "Yes, one for each birthday until I turned 18. That's a lot of letters." Emma considered this. Did she know she wouldn't be here to give them to you? Michael hugged her close, marveling at children's ability to cut straight to the heart of things. "I think she hoped she would be, but she wanted to make sure I had them, just in case. Like how you wrote me cards for my wedding day and graduation, even though those are really far away." Michael's heart stopped. He'd never told Emma about those cards, tucked away in his own safe deposit box. The parallel struck him hard. Parents trying to reach across time to touch their children's futures. Exactly like that, sweetheart. After Emma was asleep, Lisa found him still staring at the box. Without a word, she pulled up another chair and sat beside him. I keep thinking about James, Michael said. How he must have felt all these years, knowing there were pieces of my history he couldn't give me. Now I have these letters, and part of me feels like reading them might somehow, I don't know, diminish what he did for me. Lisa touched his arm gently. Or maybe reading them will help you understand why he worked so hard to preserve your connection to Rachel and David. Love multiplies, remember? Michael nodded, finally reaching for the first letter. The envelope was marked simply, for Michael's first birthday. Rachel's handwriting was delicate but clear. My dearest Michael, you're sleeping in your crib as I write this, barely a week old. The doctors say I should rest, but I need to do this while I can. There's so much I want to tell you, so many hopes I have for your future. Your father, David, would have adored you. You have his eyes already. James noticed it the moment you were born. James, I need you to know about James Anderson. He's more than just your father's best friend. When David died, James promised to look after us. He's been my rock these past months, and I know that if anything happens to me, he'll make sure you're loved and protected. I'm writing these letters because mothers should be there for their children's birthdays. If I can't be there in person, I want my words to reach across time and tell you how deeply you are loved. You were created in love, carried in love, and you will always be surrounded by love. Happy first birthday, my beautiful boy. All my love, Mom. Michael's vision blurred as he reached for the second letter. Each envelope revealed more of Rachel's heart, her hopes, her fierce love for her unborn child. She wrote about David's dreams for their future, about James's promises to watch over them, about her own wishes for her son's life. The letter for his 5th birthday contained a sketch. Rachel had been an artist too. It seemed of what she imagined he might look like. The resemblance to Emma was startling. By midnight, he had read through age 10, each letter adding layers to his understanding of the woman who had given him life. Lisa stayed beside him, offering silent support as he pieced together another dimension of his identity. The letter marked for his 18th birthday was thicker than the others. Inside, he found not only Rachel's words, but also the sheet music for Blackbird with her annotations, and a small key. My dearest Michael, if you're reading this, you've reached adulthood without me there to see it. I pray that's not the case, that I'm handing you this letter in person. But if not, there's something you should know. In my family, we had a tradition of keeping memory boxes, collections of the most important moments in our lives. I've been keeping one for you since I learned I was pregnant. It's in a safe deposit box at First National Bank in Boston. Catherine knows about it and has been adding to it over the years. The key enclosed will open it. Inside, you'll find everything I wanted to share with you. My journals, photographs, the first song I ever wrote for you. Even the tiny hat David bought when he learned he was going to be a father. Whatever happened, whatever path brought you to this letter, know that you were loved from your very first moment. David loved you before he ever saw you. I loved you with every breath, and I know, with absolute certainty, that you grew up surrounded by love because James Anderson promised me you would, and James Anderson never breaks his promises. Happy birthday, my grown-up son. All my love, for all time. Mom, the flight to Boston was scheduled for early June, when Emma would be finished with school. Michael spent the intervening weeks absorbing the remaining letters, each one revealing new facets of his mother's character. Catherine had already arranged for access to the safe deposit box, though she admitted she'd never looked inside, honoring Rachel's wish that it be opened only by her son. One evening, as Michael packed away the letters, he found Sarah's number on his phone. His finger hovered over it before pressing dial. "Mom, I need to ask you something." There was a pause on the other end. About Rachel? Did you know? About the letters, the safe deposit box? Sarah's voice was soft. No, but I knew Rachel had left something for you. James, your father. He searched for years, trying to find whatever she might have left behind. He was afraid you'd think we'd kept it from you intentionally. I don't, Michael assured her. Everything makes more sense now. Why Dad kept all those records. Why he was so careful to preserve every detail about David and Rachel. He wanted you to have all your parents, Michael. Not just the ones who raised you, but the ones who created you. She paused. Are you going to Boston? Next month. Would you like to come? The silence stretched for a moment. Are you sure? Mom, you're part of this story too. You chose to be my mother when you didn't have to be. I'd like you there when I open Rachel's box. He could hear the tears in her voice as she agreed. The weeks passed quickly. Michael found himself paying more attention to his own memory keeping, starting a journal like David's, recording thoughts and observations for Emma's future. Lisa caught him one night, writing late in his study. What are you working on? She asked. Letters, he admitted, for Emma. One for each birthday until she's 18, like Rachel did. And something else. He showed her the leather-bound book he'd started. I'm writing down everything I've learned about both my father's and my mother. Our family story isn't simple, but it's ours. The day before the Boston trip, Michael visited James's grave. The headstone was still new, the earth barely settled. He placed a single white rose, Rachel's favorite, according to Catherine, beside the fresh flowers Sarah must have left. Thank you, he said quietly, for keeping them alive for me, for being the father they wanted me to have, for loving me enough to let me find my way to this truth. The Boston Bank was an imposing granite building in the financial district. Catherine met them in the lobby, hugging Sarah with surprising warmth. Emma held both women's hands as they followed the bank manager to the vault. The safe deposit box was larger than Michael expected. His hands trembled as he inserted Rachel's key, the metal warm from decades of waiting. Inside, he found a carefully organized collection of his mother's life. The first item was a journal, its pages filled with Rachel's thoughts throughout her pregnancy. Below it lay a small knit hat, the one David had bought, along with ultrasound pictures, hospital bracelets, and a cassette tape labeled Baby's First Symphony in David's handwriting. He recorded all your favorite classical pieces, Catherine explained. Said every Miller needed a proper musical education from the start. Deeper in the box, Michael found Rachel's nursing credentials, her high school yearbook, and a folder of her artwork. Each sketch seemed to capture some essential truth about its subject. There was David in his uniform, James looking younger and unburdened, Catherine laughing at some forgotten joke. At the bottom lay a sealed envelope marked for James Anderson. Michael's breath caught. She must have known, Sarah whispered. Known that he would be your father. Michael opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter and a photograph he'd never seen before. Rachel and James at the hospital, both looking down at a newborn baby in Rachel's arms. The letter was brief but profound. Dear James, if you're reading this, it means you've kept your promise. Not just to David, but to me. You've given our son the love of two fathers and the strength of two families. Thank you for being the man David always said you were. Take care of our boy. Rachel Emma tugged at his sleeve. Daddy, you're crying again. Happy tears, sweetheart, Michael said, pulling her close. Sometimes when you find pieces of your past, they help you understand your present better. Sarah and Catherine stood together. These two mothers, one by choice, one by blood connection, united in their love for Rachel's son. Lisa squeezed Michael's hand as he carefully repacked the box, each item a thread in the tapestry of his identity. What happens now? Emma asked. Michael looked at his daughter, seeing Rachel's smile, David's eyes, and James's quiet strength reflected in her innocent question. Now we keep telling our story, he said. All of it. The love, the loss, the choices that brought us here. Because that's what families do. They hold on to their memories and pass them on. 1 year later, Michael stood at a podium in the university's main auditorium. The room was filled with students, faculty, and family, both chosen and biological. Catherine sat beside Sarah in the front row, Emma between them wearing her grandfather's navy cap. Lisa stood off to the side, ready to unveil the display case that had been months in the making. Today, Michael began, we dedicate the Anderson Miller collection on military families. This archive represents more than just historical documents or personal artifacts. It tells the story of how war and love, loss and choice can weave together to create something extraordinary. The display case contained carefully curated items. David's journal opened to a particularly poignant entry. Rachel's sketches of her husband and best friend. James's meticulous records of Michael's childhood. Photos showed 4 parents who had shaped one life through presence or absence, choice or circumstance. My father, James Anderson, spent his career teaching history, Michael continued. But his greatest lesson was about family, about how love transcends blood, about how choices can echo through generations. When he preserved these materials, he wasn't just archiving war records. He was protecting a love story that spanned decades and defied conventional definitions of family. He touched the glass case gently. Lieutenant David Miller and Rachel Taylor Miller gave me life. Their love created me, and their loss shaped me. James and Sarah Anderson gave me a home, an identity, and the courage to embrace all parts of my heritage. This collection honors all of them. 2 fathers, 2 mothers, 1 family. Emma had helped arrange the photographs, insisting that her favorite picture of Rachel singing takes center place. Beside it lay the yellow baby blanket, preserved now for future generations to see. The cassette tapes had been digitized, Rachel's voice saved from the decay of magnetic tape. In this collection, researchers will find military records, personal correspondence, and documentation of how war affects families across generations. But more importantly, they'll find evidence of how love can bridge any gap, heal any wound, create family from tragedy. Catherine and Sarah had become close friends over the past year, sharing stories of Rachel, helping Emma understand her complex family tree. They'd even traveled together to Vietnam, visiting the place where David had made his final sacrifice. My daughter recently asked me how many grandparents she has, Michael said, smiling at Emma. I told her she has more love in her heritage than most people could imagine. She has a grandfather who gave his life for his friend, a grandmother who loved her before she existed, and grandparents who chose to build a family through love rather than obligation. Lisa stepped forward, revealing the final piece of the collection, a new leather-bound journal, its pages already partially filled. This is my contribution to the archive, Michael explained. I'm recording our ongoing story, how we discovered each other, how we're learning to be a family that spans time and tragedy, blood and choice. It's a story that will continue long after we're gone, teaching future generations that family is not limited by biology or circumstance. He reached the end of his prepared remarks, but felt compelled to add something more personal. A year ago, I thought I knew who I was, the son of James Anderson, professor and veteran. Now I know I'm more, the son of David Miller, who died a hero, of Rachel Miller, who loved me enough to reach across time, of James Anderson, who chose to be my father, and of Sarah Anderson, who chose to be my mother. Emma ran up to the podium then, unable to contain herself any longer. Michael lifted her up, and she proudly pointed to the display. That's all my grandparents, she announced to the crowd. And they all loved my daddy, which means they all love me too. The audience laughed softly, but Michael saw Catherine and Sarah wiping tears away. Lisa joined them at the podium, completing their present-day family picture. The Anderson Miller collection will be open to researchers starting next week, Michael concluded. But its most important lesson can't be found in any document or photograph. It's the truth that my fathers and mothers taught me, that love multiplies, that family is both inherited and chosen, and that the heart has an infinite capacity to embrace all the pieces of who we are. Later that evening, the family gathered at Michael's house. Emma had insisted on playing Rachel's lullaby recordings, while Catherine shared new stories about her sister's nursing days. Sarah brought out old photos of Michael's childhood, now made richer by their fuller understanding of his heritage. As the grandfather clock struck midnight, Michael sat in his study, opening his journal to a fresh page. He had begun a tradition of writing an entry on significant dates, addressing them to both his fathers and both his mothers. Tonight's entry was simple but profound. Dear Dad, Mom, Father, and Mother, today we brought all the pieces of our family together, past and present, blood and choice, loss and love. Anna understands now that she comes from a legacy of extraordinary love, that her family tree has roots in sacrifice and branches in choice. James, you kept their memory alive until I was ready to understand. Sarah, you opened your heart to a child who needed a mother. David, you gave your life protecting the man who would raise your son. Rachel, you loved me enough to make sure I would know that love even in your absence. I am all of yours, and that makes me more, not less. Emma is all of yours too, carrying forward the best of each of you. And this story, our story, will continue to touch lives long after we're gone, teaching others that family is not about biology or obligation, but about love and choice and the courage to embrace all the pieces of who we are. With love and gratitude, your son, Michael. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to support us by leaving a like and subscribing to our Slices of Life channel. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Which city are you talking about? It's very rewarding for us to provide our followers with an enjoyable moment. We appreciate the unconditional support you show us in every story. Blessings!